Welcome to my channel.
The wind over Lochdubh didn't just blow, it searched. It poked icy fingers through the cracks in the windows of the police station, rattled the door as if demanding entry, and carried the scent of a heavy Highland winter. PC Hamish Macbeth, a tall, lanky man with a shock of unruly red hair, sat by his peat stove, staring longingly at the blue smoke rising from his pipe. In his lap sat a thick woolen sock he was half-heartedly darning. On the floor lay Lugs, a dog of uncertain parentage and even more uncertain temperament, who was currently dreaming of rabbits and twitching a ragged ear. Hamish was practicing the art of being invisible. Experience had taught him that if he looked busy enough to be left alone, but not so busy that he attracted the attention of the authorities in Strathbane, he might survive the week without a headache. Unfortunately, the telephone, a black plastic instrument of torture, began to ring. Hamish stared at it. He considered the possibility that if he ignored it, the caller might simply go away, but the ringing was persistent, much like the drizzle that had turned into a biting sleet outside. With a sigh that spoke of centuries of Highland weariness, he picked up the receiver. "Lochdubh Police Station, Macbeth speaking," he said, his voice a soft, deceptive lilt. "Macbeth, you lazy heather-stepping turnip!" The voice of Detective Chief Inspector Blair roared through the line, vibrating Hamish's eardrum. "I've had a call from the Tommel Castle Hotel. Some big-shot Englishman is throwing a fit because his fancy motor car is stuck in a drift 3 miles out, and he says the local constabulary, that's you useless article, is nowhere to be found. It's a terrible storm, sir," Hamish said mildly, looking out at the swirling white void. "The sheep are huddling, and even the crows are walking. It's hardly the weather for a summer-tire Jaguar. I don't care if the crows are taking the bus. Get out there, dig him out, and escort him to the hotel. He's a property developer named Julian Vane. Important people, Macbeth. Not that you'd know what important means unless it's a sale on tobacco or a free dram." The line went dead. Hamish sighed again and looked at Lugs. "Duty calls, Lugs, though why a man with all that money cannot check a weather report is beyond me." Hamish donned his heavy greatcoat and pulled a deerstalker hat low over his ears. He wasn't particularly fond of the hat. It made him look like a postcard, but it kept the sleet out of his neck. The drive out of the village was a slow crawl through a world turned white. The mountains, usually purple and grand, were now jagged ghosts lost in the mist. About 3 miles toward the coast he spotted it, a sleek silver Jaguar XJ, looking entirely ridiculous and very stuck in a ditch. Standing beside the car was a man who looked like he had been curated by an expensive London tailor, specifically to be annoyed by Scotland. He wore a camel hair coat that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, and a pair of Italian leather shoes that were currently sinking into 6 inches of freezing slush. "About bloody time!" the man shouted as Hamish pulled the police Land Rover to a halt. "I've been here 40 minutes. Do you people not believe in gritters, or salt, or progress?" Hamish climbed out slowly, his movements deliberate and languid. "Good afternoon to you too, sir. I'm Police Constable Macbeth. It's a grand day for a walk if you're a penguin." Julian Vane glared. He was a man in his 50s with silver-slicked hair and a face that suggested he had spent his life winning arguments by shouting. "Don't get droll with me, Constable. I'm here to meet Halberton Smythes about the new resort project. Every minute I stand here, your local economy loses more money than you've seen in a lifetime. Get this car out, now." Hamish leaned against the Land Rover, unaffected. "The car's in a ditch, Mr. Vane. In this weather, with the ice underneath, I'll need a tow winch and a bit of luck. And since the only man with a winch is Jimmy Anderson, and Jimmy is currently at a funeral in Lairg, I'm afraid your car is staying here for the night." "Stay here? In the ditch?" Vane's face turned a shade of purple that rivaled the Highland heather. "I have documents in there. I've a dinner engagement. The hotel is only a mile up the road," Hamish said, reaching into the back of his vehicle for a spare pair of Wellington boots he kept for emergencies. "I can take you there, But you'll have to leave the Jaguar. The lock won't eat it, I promise, Vane grumbled, snatched his designer briefcase and climbed into the passenger seat of the Land Rover, sniffing at the faint smell of wet dog and old sandwiches. Is it always this primitive? Vane asked, looking out at the bleak, beautiful landscape with genuine disgust. No signal, no infrastructure, just rocks and rain. It's quiet, Hamish replied, his eyes on the treacherous road. People in Lochdubh like it that way. They say the silence helps you hear what's coming. Rubbish, Vane snapped. Silence is just a lack of business, but don't worry. Once my firm breaks ground on the Highland Escape Complex, we'll bring this place into the 21st century, whether you want it or not. Hamish said nothing. He simply steered the Land Rover through the gale, a small smile playing on his lips. He knew Lochdubh. The village didn't like being pushed, and the mountains had a way of swallowing people who didn't show them the proper respect. As they pulled up to the grand, ivy-covered stone walls of the Tommel Castle Hotel, Hamish caught a glimpse of a figure watching from a darkened upstairs window. It was a fleeting shadow, but it left him with a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. Julian Vane stormed into the warmth of the hotel without a word of thanks. Hamish sat in the idling Land Rover for a moment, watching the sleet turn to heavy, silent snow. "He's a delightful man, isn't he, Lugs?" Hamish murmured. Lugs let out a low, mournful cry. Hamish nodded. He had a feeling the peace of Lochdubh was about to be very loudly and very violently disturbed. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, muffling the world in a way that made the silence of the Highlands feel like a physical weight. Hamish Macbeth spent a restless night in the police station, the wind howling down the chimney like a banshee. He woke early to the sound of a frantic pounding on his door, a noise that cut through the whistling gale and sent Lugs into a frenzy of sharp territorial barks. When Hamish opened the door, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he found Archie McLean, the hotel's odd job man, standing there. Archie's face was the colour of old porridge, and his breath came in ragged, frosty gasps. "It's the Sassenach, Hamish," Archie stammered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely point toward the lock. "The one you brought in yesterday, Mr. Vane. He's in the garden, or what's left of him." Hamish felt a cold lump of dread settle in his stomach. And it wasn't just the draught from the open door. He had hoped for a quiet morning of poaching a breakfast trout, but the universe, or at least the gods of Lochdubh, clearly had other plans. He grabbed his coat and followed Archie through the deepening drifts toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. The hotel's ornamental garden was a sprawling affair of frozen hedges and stone statues, but today it featured a new, grim addition. Julian Vane was slumped over a decorative stone sundial. He was dressed in his expensive silk pajamas and the camel hair coat he had been so proud of, but the coat was now ruined. Vane was frozen solid, his eyes wide and fixed in an expression of indignant surprise, as if he were about to complain to the management about the temperature of the afterlife. What made the scene truly bizarre, and more than a little humiliating, was the way he had died. A large, heavy garden gnome, a particularly hideous specimen with a bright red hat and a fishing rod, had been shoved onto Vane's head with such force that the ceramic base had shattered, leaving the gnome's grinning face perched atop the dead man's shoulders like a surreal mask. "God help us," Hamish muttered, kneeling in the snow. He didn't touch the body, he simply observed. He noticed the lack of footprints other than Archie's and his own, the wind having swept the slate clean during the night. He saw that Vaughan's briefcase was missing, and the man's Italian leather shoes were nowhere to be seen. He was in his stocking feet. "I found him when I went to clear the path for the milk delivery," Archie said, his voice trembling. Who would do that, Hamish? To kill a man with a garden ornament? Someone with a dark sense of humour, or a very heavy grudge, Hamish replied softly. He looked at the sundial. The shadow cast by the rising sun pointed directly at the dead man's heart. It was a theatrical, ugly death, the kind that would bring the wrath of the Strathbane police down upon the village like a Highland spate. Hamish sighed, his mind already racing. He knew what would happen next. He would have to call it in, and within hours the village would be swarming with detectives who didn't understand the difference between a local feud and a professional hit. He looked at the gnome's cheerful face. The victim had been a man who wanted to pave over the Highlands, and he had been laid low by the most pedestrian of lawn decorations. There was a grim irony in it that MC Beaton would have appreciated it, but Hamish only felt a deep sense of irritation. His peaceful week was well and truly over. He walked back to the hotel lobby, which was already beginning to stir with the sounds of wealthy guests waking up to their morning tea. Mrs. Halberton Smythe, the hotel's owner and a woman who viewed the local population as a slightly disappointing species of wildlife, was standing by the reception desk. "Macbeth," she barked, her pearls clinking against her tweed chest. "What is the meaning of this commotion? I've heard rumours of a body in the garden. Surely it's just some tramp who's had too much drama." "I'm afraid not, ma'am," Hamish said, removing his hat and shaking off the slush. "It's Mr. Vane. He's been murdered, and I'm afraid the garden is now a crime scene. I'll need you to keep the guests inside until the CID arrives from Strathbane." Mrs. Halberton Smythe's face turned a delicate shade of grey. "Murdered in my garden? This is most inconvenient, Macbeth. We have the winter gala tomorrow. People will be arriving from all over the country." "The dead have a way of being inconvenient," Hamish said mildly. He moved to the hotel's payphone to make the dreaded call. As he waited for the operator, he watched the guests through the glass doors of the dining room. There was an air of tension that hadn't been there the night before. People were whispering, looking over their shoulders and avoiding each other's eyes. He saw Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the owner's daughter and the perennial object of his frustrated affection, standing near the fireplace. She looked pale and thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the snow outside. She caught his eye and gave a small, sad nod. Even from a distance, Hamish could see that she knew more than she was saying. The phone clicked, and the voice of the desk sergeant at Strathbane answered. Hamish reported the crime, knowing that within the hour, Lochdubh's peace would be shattered by the arrival of DCI Blair. He hung up and stood for a moment, listening to the hotel's silence. It was a silence filled with secrets. Vane had been a man who made enemies for a living, but to be killed with a gnome in the middle of a blizzard suggested something more personal. Hamish walked back out into the cold, lugs trailing at his heels. He stood by the body one last time, looking at the way the snow was already beginning to drift over Vane's expensive coat. He noticed a small piece of blue silk caught in the garden's wrought-iron gate, a tiny fragment that didn't belong to a camel hair coat or a garden gnome. He tucked it into his pocket just as the distant wail of a siren began to echo through the glen. The outsiders were coming, and they would bring their noise, their arrogance, and their total lack of understanding of the Highland heart. Hamish took a deep breath of the icy air, knowing he would have to play the fool for a while longer if he wanted to catch a killer who moved like a ghost in the white. The siren grew louder, a jagged mechanical scream that tore through the muffled sanctity of the Highland morning. 2 black police sedans skidded into the Tommel Castle driveway, kicking up a slushy spray of salt and grit that coated the pristine white snow. Before the engines had even ceased their rattling, the doors flew open. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face already a dangerous shade of crimson that suggested his blood pressure was currently engaged in a private war with his collar. Following him were Detectives Anderson and McLean, looking like 2 bedraggled crows in their cheap, ill-fitting suits. Blair marched toward Hamish, his heavy boots crunching through the snow with a purposeful aggression that seemed intended to intimidate the very earth itself. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the hotel and likely disturbing the peace as far away as Skibo. "What in the name of the devil's hindquarters have you done now? I leave you alone for 5 minutes in this god-forsaken puddle of a village, and you managed to let an international businessman get his head caved in by a ceramic midget." Hamish stood his ground, his hands deep in his greatcoat pockets, his expression one of polite, slightly bewildered vacancy. "Good morning to you, sir. It's a tragic business, surely, But I didn't let it happen, sir. The man was dead long before the sun hit the loch. Blair didn't listen. He never did. He pushed past Hamish, nearly knocking lugs into a snowbank, and stomped toward the sundial where Julian Vane still wore his macabre grinning headpiece. Blair stopped and stared, his lip curling in a mixture of disgust and professional irritation. "A gnome, Macbeth? You're telling me a man worth millions was taken out by a piece of lawn furniture? This is a mockery. It's an insult to the Scottish Crime Division. Look at him. He looks like he's auditioning for a bloody pantomime." "It is a bit unusual, sir," Hamish agreed softly, hovering at a respectful distance. "But if you look at the angle of the strike, it seems—" "I don't need a lecture on angles from a man who spends his days chasing sheep and poaching salmon," Blair snapped, turning back to face Hamish with a finger jabbed toward his chest. "I've seen this 100 times. It's a local job. Some thick-headed peasant didn't like the idea of a new hotel, got himself a skinful of whiskey, and decided to take a swing with the nearest heavy object. It's pathetic. It's simple. And I'll have the handcuffs on the culprit before the bar opens for lunch." Blair turned to Anderson and McLean, who were shivering violently in the biting wind. "You two, get into that hotel, get a list of every staff member who's ever had a parking ticket or a bad word to say about the English. And find out who owns this gnome. There can't be many people in this village with such an execrable taste." Hamish watched them go, his mind noting the way Blair was already contaminating the scene. The DCI was trampling over the very spots where a more subtle investigator might have found a partial print or a dropped thread. Blair's method of investigation was akin to using a sledgehammer to open a walnut. He usually got to the meat, but there was nothing left but shattered remains and bitterness. "I noticed the victim's shoes were missing, sir," Hamish offered tentatively, hoping to steer the bull in a slightly more productive direction. "And his briefcase. It seems like a lot of effort to go through just for a drunken assault." Blair let out a bark of derisive laughter. "Missing shoes? The man probably lost them in the struggle, or some local thief took them because they cost more than his cottage. As for the briefcase, it'll be in the loch by now. This isn't a spy novel, Macbeth. It's a Highland brawl that went too far. Now, get out of my sight. Go and stand by the gate and try to look like a real policeman. Don't speak to the press, don't speak to the guests, and for the love of all that is holy, don't try to think. It only leads to trouble." Hamish touched the peak of his deerstalker hat in a mock salute and whistled for lugs. He retreated toward the hotel's side entrance, his gait slow and seemingly aimless. To the casual observer, and certainly to DCI Blair, he looked like a man who had been thoroughly put in his place, a defeated village bobby relegated to the sidelines. But Hamish's eyes were far from vacant. He was watching the way the hotel staff peered through the windows, their faces pale and pinched with a specific kind of local anxiety. He saw the way the head gardener, a sour-faced man named Angus, was staring at the shattered remains of the gnome with a look that wasn't so much grief as it was intense calculation. The arrogance of the Strathbane team was his greatest asset. Because Blair dismissed him as a useless peasant, Hamish was free to move through the village like the mountain mist, unnoticed and underestimated. He knew well that a drunken local wouldn't have bothered to remove a man's shoes in a blizzard, nor would they have been able to kill him with such surgical, albeit grotesque, precision. The gnome hadn't just been swung. It had been dropped or thrust from a height, or perhaps used as a finishing touch after the man was already incapacitated. As he reached the shelter of the stone porch, he felt a presence behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew the scent of expensive French soap and Highland rain that always accompanied Priscilla Halberton Smythe. "He's going to arrest Archie, isn't he?" she asked, her voice low and worried. "Blair likes an easy target, Priscilla," Hamish replied, finally turning to look at her. She was wrapped in a thick woolen cloak, her dark hair damp with melted snow. "Archie found the body. He's local, and he's easily intimidated. In Blair's world, that's as good as a confession. But Archie wouldn't hurt a fly," she protested. "He was terrified, Hamish. He came to me first, shaking like a leaf. I know that. And you know that, Hamish said, his gaze drifting back to the crime scene where Blair was currently shouting at a terrified maid. But the DCI isn't interested in the soul of a man. He's interested in a closed file and a headline in the Strathbane Gazette. I'll have to go for a bit of a wander, I think. See who's talking and, more importantly, who's suddenly gone very quiet. Priscilla looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face. Be careful, Hamish. Mr. Vane was no mere property developer. He had his hands in many very dirty pockets. If someone here killed him, they didn't do it for the sport of it. I'm always careful, Hamish lied gently. He watched her walk back into the hotel, noting the slight stiffness in her posture. Even the gentry were on edge. He waited until Blair was occupied with a thermos of tea before slipping away toward the village, the small scrap of blue silk burning a hole in his pocket. He needed a cup of tea, a warm fire, and the company of people who knew how to tell a lie without blinking. The official investigation had begun with a roar, but Hamish knew the real answers would be found in a whisper. Hamish left the chaos of the hotel grounds behind, his long legs eating up the distance as he trekked back toward the heart of Lochdubh. The snow had tapered off into a fine, powdery dust that swirled around his ankles, but the air remained sharp enough to sting the lungs. To DCI Blair, Hamish was merely retreating to sulk in his station, but to anyone who truly knew the red-haired policeman, his aimless saunter was the start of a calculated hunt. He didn't head for the police station. Instead, he made a direct line for the post office and general store, the undisputed nerve centre of village intelligence. If a stranger had sneezed in Lochdubh 3 days ago, Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, would have already diagnosed the brand of their handkerchief. The bell above the door gave a cheerful jingle as Hamish stepped inside, the sudden warmth of the shop causing his nose to tingle with the scents of floor wax, peppermint, and damp wool. Mrs. Kennedy was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the very tip of her nose as she sorted a stack of pension books. She looked up, her sharp eyes magnifying behind the glass. "A terrible business, Hamish," she said, without even a greeting. "A man murdered a garden gnome. It's the sort of thing they have in Glasgow, not here. And poor Archie McLean being dragged into it. I saw that man Blair shouting at him from the window. The man's a brute, Hamish. A loud-mouthed, city-bred brute." "He has his ways, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied, leaning casually against the counter and adopting his most vacant, relaxed expression. "He's a great believer in the direct approach. Not like us slow Highlanders. I suppose you wouldn't happen to have a pot of tea on the go? It's a bitter day for standing around garden ornaments." "I just put the kettle on," she said, her expression softening. She beckoned him into the small back parlour, a space crowded with lace doilies and photographs of grandchildren. As she poured 2 mugs of dark, over-steeped tea, Hamish noticed her hands were surprisingly steady. "So, what are they saying at the hotel? Was it the Russian mafia? I heard Mr. Vane had dealings with some very shady characters in the East." "Blair thinks it was a local," Hamish said, blowing on his tea. "He's looking for someone with a grudge and a strong arm. He's quite convinced it's simple." Mrs. Kennedy snorted, a sound of pure Highland derision. "Simple? There's nothing simple about Julian Vane. He was here 3 weeks ago, you know, before he officially arrived yesterday. He stayed at the hotel under a different name, Mr. Smith, if you please. As if we wouldn't notice a man wearing a watch that costs more than a tractor. He spent his afternoons walking the perimeter of the old Curry estate. He wasn't looking at the view, Hamish, he was measuring." Hamish took a slow sip of tea, his mind filing the information away. "The Curry estate? That's the land bordering the Kirk, isn't it? The piece that Mrs. Galloway has been trying to turn into a bird sanctuary for the last decade?" "The very same," Mrs. Kennedy whispered, leaning in closer. "And he wasn't alone. I saw him meet Mr. Lovat, the minister. Now why would a London property tycoon be whispering in the vestry with a man of the cloth? Mr. Lovat has been looking very pinched lately, even for a man who preaches on the fires of hell every Sunday." Hamish thanked her for the tea and the gossip, leaving a few coins on the table for a packet of ginger nuts he didn't really want. His next stop was the Lochdubh curry house, where Mr. Patel was busy prepping for the lunch rush. The shop was small and smelled wonderfully of cumin and fried onions, a stark contrast to the sterile, icy air outside. "Constable Macbeth," Mr. Patel greeted him, wiping his hands on a flowery apron. "A sad day, truly. This Mr. Vane, he came here last night, very late, just before we closed. He wanted a vindaloo, but he was in a state. Not drunk, no, agitated. He kept checking his phone, but of course there was no signal in the village. He asked if I had a landline he could use for an international call." "And did he use it?" Hamish asked, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. "He tried, but he became very angry. He shouted at someone on the other end about the blueprints and the final payment. Then he slammed the phone and left without his food. I still have the vindaloo in the fridge. Waste of a good sauce." Hamish nodded, a pattern beginning to form in the midst of his thoughts. He stepped back out into the street, the ginger nuts tucked into his pocket. He had learned more in 20 minutes of mooching than Blair would learn in 20 hours of interrogation. Vane hadn't just been a developer, he had been a man under pressure, hiding his identity, and dealing with local figures in secret. As he walked toward the manse to see the minister, he passed the village smithy. Angus, the gardener he had seen earlier at the hotel, was there, sharpening a set of shears with a ferocity that seemed unnecessary. Hamish stopped and leaned over the half door. "Busy morning, Angus. I'd have thought you'd be up at the hotel helping the police." Angus didn't look up, the sparks from the grindstone dancing in the dim light. "I do my job, Macbeth. I don't get paid to talk to the CID. That gnome was mine, you know. Gift from my sister in Perth. Someone stole it from my shed 2 nights ago. I told the hotel manager, but he didn't care. Now it's evidence and I'll never see it again." "Stolen, was it?" Hamish asked mildly. "Funny thing to steal in a blizzard." Well, people in this village are stranger than they look," Angus grunted. Hamish continued his walk, his mind turning over the image of the gnome. Had it been stolen 2 nights ago, the murder had been premeditated. Someone had waited for Vane to arrive, waited for the snow to hide their movements, and then used a stolen weapon to finish the job. He reached into his pocket and felt the scrap of blue silk he had found at the gate. It felt expensive, much like the silk pyjamas Vane had been wearing. But Vane's pyjamas were burgundy. The mystery was deepening, and as he approached the manse he saw a black car, not a police car, parked in the shadows of the old stone walls. It was a vehicle he recognized, one that belonged to the upper-class circles of the county. The plot was no longer just about a dead Sassenach. It was beginning to involve the very fabric of Lochdubh's social hierarchy. Hamish slowed his pace, whistling a low, mournful tune. He needed to be very careful now. When the gentry started hiding in the shadows of the church, the truth was usually something that could burn a man's fingers. Hamish stood for a moment outside the manse, watching the exhaust fumes from the black car dissipate into the freezing Highland air. The vehicle belonged to the Halbert and Smythe estate, but it wasn't the usual Land Rover the Colonel used for shooting parties. It was a sleek, older Bentley, maintained with the kind of obsessive care that spoke of old money and even older secrets. Before Hamish could decide whether to approach, the driver's side door opened, and Priscilla Halbert and Smythe stepped out. She looked startled to see him, her hand flying to the throat of her cloak, but she quickly composed herself, her face settling into that mask of cool, aristocratic detachment that always made Hamish feel like he was wearing his shoes on the wrong feet. "Hamish," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "I thought you were back at the station, or perhaps avoiding DCI Blair in the kitchen of the hotel." "I'm just doing a bit of a circuit, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his gaze drifting from her face to the heavy oak door of the minister's house. "It's a strange day when the daughter of the big house is visiting Mr. Lovat so early in the morning, especially with a dead man still cooling in her mother's garden. Is the Colonel feeling the need for spiritual guidance?" Priscilla sighed, a plume of white breath escaping into the air. She stepped closer to him, her eyes darting toward the windows of the manse. "Don't be droll, Hamish. It's a mess. My father is in a towering rage because Vane's death has frozen the bank accounts tied to the development. And Mr. Lovat, well, the minister is in a state of collapse. He's been receiving letters, Hamish. Anonymous ones. They claim that the land Vane wanted to buy, the Curry estate, isn't actually the Kirk's to sell. Hamish tilted his head, his interest piqued. The Currys were an old family, but they died out in the 50s. The land was left to the village in trust, or so the story goes. That's what everyone believed, Priscilla said, her voice dropping even lower. But Vane found something, or someone found something and sold it to him. There's a rumour of a surviving heir, someone who would have a prior claim and could stop the development entirely. Vane wasn't just here to build a resort, he was here to bribe or bury the evidence of that heir before the first stone was turned. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out the small scrap of blue silk he had found earlier. He held it between two fingers. Priscilla's eyes widened, and for a fleeting second her composure shattered. She recognized it. "That's from a pashmina," she murmured, "an expensive one. I saw Elspeth Grant wearing one just like it at the drinks party Vane held in Strathbane last week, but Elspeth is in London, isn't she?" "She was supposed to be," Hamish said, his mind whirring. Elspeth Grant was a journalist with a sharp wit and an even sharper ambition, a woman who had often played a confusing role in Hamish's life, somewhere between a romantic interest and a professional headache. But if this silk is here, then Elspeth, or someone with her very specific taste in Italian fabrics, was climbing over the hotel gates in the middle of a snowstorm. The door to the manse opened then, and Mr. Lovat peered out. The minister looked as though he had aged a decade overnight. His clerical collar was crooked, and his eyes were bloodshot. When he saw Hamish standing with Priscilla, he made to shut the door, but Hamish moved with surprising speed, placing a large muddy boot in the jamb. "A word, Minister?" Hamish asked, his voice soft but carrying a steel edge that Brook Street or Strathbane rarely saw. "I hear you've been having a bit of a correspondence. It's a terrible thing to post these days, full of demands and threats." Lovat looked trapped. He glanced at Priscilla, who gave him a look of profound sympathy before turning back to Hamish. "I'll leave you, Hamish, but be careful. The social dynamics of this county are like the peat bogs. Step in the wrong place and you'll be in over your head before you can cry for help." She climbed back into the Bentley and drove away, leaving Hamish alone with the trembling minister. Lovat beckoned him inside, the manse smelling of damp paper and stale tea. In the study, the minister collapsed into a chair, gesturing toward a pile of papers on his desk. "Vane was a monster, Macbeth," Lovat rasped. "He came to me with proof. He knew the Kirk had been using the income from the Curry Trust to cover the repairs on the roof for 20 years. Legally, we should have been looking for the heirs, but the money was there, and the roof was leaking, and I was weak. Vane said he would settle the Trust's debts and build his resort, and no one would ever be the wiser. But then the letters started. Someone else knew. Someone was watching him and me." "Did Vane know who was sending them?" Hamish asked, leaning against a bookshelf. He thought it was Elspeth Grant. He thought she was digging for a story to ruin him. He was supposed to meet her last night, at the edge of the garden, to buy her silence. He told me he was going to handle the girl. But look what happened. He's dead, and I'm a ruined man. Hamish looked at the minister, feeling a flicker of pity mixed with his usual skepticism. The lazy policeman was gone, replaced by the man who saw the world for exactly what it was. He then realized the murder wasn't just a property deal. It was about the collision of two worlds, the desperate ambition of the outsider and the quiet, crushing weight of Highland shame. "I wouldn't worry about being ruined just yet, Minister," Hamish said, picking up a ginger nut from the packet in his pocket and offering it to the man. "Blair is currently trying to pin the whole thing on Archie McLean because he found stray hair on Archie's jumper. But if Elspeth was here, and if she was meeting Vane, we have a different problem. Elspeth doesn't kill people with garden gnomes. She uses a pen. The gnome is personal, it's local." Hamish left the manse and stood in the churchyard looking up at the grey sky. He thought of Priscilla's warning, the blue silk, the minister's greed, the missing shoes and the stolen gnome. The pieces were beginning to rattle together in his head like stones in a burn. He needed to find Elspeth, but more importantly, he needed to find out who in Lochdubh hated Julian Vane enough to turn him into a lawn ornament. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from behind a headstone with a discarded silk ribbon in his mouth. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish whispered, taking the ribbon. It was the same blue as the scrap in his pocket. "The gentry are definitely up to their necks in it. Let's go and see what the useless peasant can find while the big men are busy shouting at the innocent." He began to walk back toward the hotel, his mind already setting the first pegs of a trap. He had a feeling that the red-hatted gnome wasn't just a weapon, it was a message, and he was the only one in the Highlands who knew how to read it. Hamish made his way back toward the hotel, the blue silk ribbon tucked safely inside his glove. The snow was beginning to drift, forming undulating waves against the stone dikes that lined the road. As he approached the grand entrance of the Tommel Castle Hotel, he saw a sight that made his heart sink. DCI Blair was standing on the front steps, his chest puffed out like a territorial pigeon, while two of his subordinates were unceremoniously hauling Archie McLean toward the waiting police cars. Archie was weeping, his thin shoulders heaving under his tattered donkey jacket, his feet dragging through the slush. "There he is, the village hero," Blair shouted when he spotted Hamish. "While you've been off playing hide-and-seek in the heather, Macbeth, I've solved your murder. It's exactly as I said. Local greed, local stupidity. We found the victim's silver cigarette case hidden in the back of McLean's locker in the potting shed, along with a pair of blood-spattered trousers. Open and shut, wouldn't you say? Even for a mental giant like yourself." Hamish stopped, his face a mask of dull-witted surprise. He looked from the sobbing Archie to the smug, red-faced DCI. "The cigarette case, sir, that's a very clumsy thing for a man to keep if he's just committed a murder. And the trousers? Archie's a gardener, sir. He's usually covered in something or other, though usually it's fish guts or peat." "It's blood, you fool," Blair barked, stepping down to loom over Hamish. "Forensics will confirm it, but I don't need a lab to tell me a guilty man when I see one." He found Vane in the garden, realized the man was a walking gold mine, and did him in for the trinkets. He probably panicked and used the gnome because it was the first thing his tiny brain could grasp. "Now, get out of the way. I've a press release to dictate and a victory point with my name on it in Strathbane." "But what about the shoes, sir?" Hamish asked, his voice trailing off as if he were struggling to keep up. "And the briefcase? Archie doesn't have a car, and he hasn't left the grounds. If he took them, they'd be here. But we've searched the sheds, haven't we?" Blair let out a snarl of pure exasperation. "He threw them in the loch, Macbeth, or he buried them. It doesn't matter. I have a gun, motive, and stolen property. Now, move." Hamish stepped aside, watching as the cars sped away, their tyres throwing a dirty grey slush over the pristine snowbanks. He waited until the sound of the sirens had faded into the distance before turning his attention back to the hotel. He didn't believe for a second that Archie McLean was a killer. Archie was a man who apologized to the weeds before he pulled them. More importantly, Hamish had seen Archie's locker only a week ago when he dropped off some poached salmon for the kitchen staff. The lock was so rusted it didn't even catch. Anyone could have slipped a cigarette case and a pair of trousers inside. He walked around the side of the building toward the conservatory, where the light was soft and the air smelled of damp earth and geraniums. Through the glass he saw Elspeth Grant. She wasn't in London at all. She was sitting in a wicker chair, looking remarkably composed for a woman whose pashmina was currently in pieces in a policeman's pocket. She was sipping a cup of black coffee, her eyes fixed on a notebook. Hamish entered the conservatory, the warmth hitting him like a physical blow. Elspeth looked up, a small knowing smile playing on her lips. "I wondered how long it would take the local law to sniff me out, Hamish. You're later than usual. Have you been busy watching Blair arrest the wrong person?" "I see news travels fast," Hamish said, pulling up a chair opposite her. He placed the blue silk ribbon on the table between them. "I found your scarf, Elspeth. Or at least the parts of it that the garden gate didn't keep for itself. Why are you here? And why were you climbing over fences in a blizzard last night?" Elspeth didn't flinch. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing. I'm here for the same reason Vane was, information. Julian Vane wasn't just building a hotel, Hamish. He was running a massive money laundering operation through Highland Escape. I've been tracking his offshore accounts for months. I knew he was coming here to finalize the deal with the Curry estate, and I wanted the proof. I was supposed to meet him at midnight by the sundial. He promised me the real story in exchange for me killing the exposé I was writing. And did you meet him? I tried, she said, her voice dropping an octave. But when I got to the gate, the wind was so high I could barely stand. I saw a figure in the garden, a tall man in a heavy coat. I thought it was Vane. I called, but he didn't answer. He was bent over the sundial doing something. Then I heard a sound, a terrible wet thud, and I panicked. I caught my pashmina on the gate as I scrambled back toward the road. I spent the rest of the night in a B&B in Drim, terrified that whoever was in that garden had seen me. A tall man in a heavy coat? Hamish asked, his mind jumping back to the silhouette he had seen in the window the night before. Not Archie McLean, then? Hardly, Elspeth snorted. Archie is 5'4" and walks like a crab. This man was substantial, powerful. He moved with a kind of grim efficiency. He wasn't robbing Vane, Hamish. He was executing him. Hamish stood up, his gaze drifting to the window. The red herring of Archie's guilt was a convenient curtain drawn by someone who knew exactly how DCI Blair's mind worked. By planting the cigarette case, the killer had bought themselves time. But Elspeth's testimony, though she was a woman prone to exaggeration, changed the shape of the puzzle. The motive wasn't the petty theft of a cigarette case, and it wasn't just a property dispute. It was something deeper, something that required Vane to be not just dead, but humiliated. "Stay here, Elspeth," Hamish said, his voice quiet and firm. "And for once in your life, keep your notes to yourself. If the man you saw realizes you were there, a garden gnome will be the least of your worries." He walked out of the conservatory, his mind turning toward the one person who had been oddly silent through the entire morning. The head gardener, Angus, had claimed his gnome was stolen 2 nights ago. But Angus was a man who noticed every broken twig and every misplaced stone. Had someone been in his shed, he would have known. And Angus, as it happened, was a very tall man with a very heavy coat. Hamish realized with a jolt of clarity that the murder wasn't about what Vane was building, it was about what he was destroying. He needed to know more about the surviving heir Priscilla had mentioned. If Vane had been trying to bribe someone to stay hidden, he might have picked the wrong person to insult. Hamish began to walk toward the village library, ignoring the cold. The real story wasn't in the blood on Archie's trousers, it was in the dusty ledgers of Lochdubh's past, and he had a feeling the killer was someone who had been standing in plain sight all along, waiting for the stupid policeman to look the other way. The library in Lochdubh was a small, draughty building that smelled of damp vellum and the peppermint lozenges favoured by the librarian, Miss Stevenson. Hamish entered quietly, the bell muffled by a bit of rag he'd tied around it months ago to facilitate his own afternoon naps in the reference section. Miss Stevenson looked up from her ledger, her eyes sharp behind thick spectacles. She was a woman who guarded the village records with the ferocity of a dragon guarding a hoard of gold, and she had little patience for the modern methods of the Strathbane police. "I suppose you're here about the Curry Trust, Hamish," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "I saw that man Blair stomping about the village earlier. He came in here demanding to see the property deeds, but when I told him they were filed by genealogical succession and not by street address, he turned purple and left. A very rude man, that. He's the sort who would dog-ear a first edition." "He's a man in a hurry, Miss Stevenson," Hamish replied, leaning against the mahogany desk. "And a man in a hurry misses the small print. What can you tell me about the Curry estate's heirs?" Priscilla Halberton-Smythe mentioned there might be someone still drawing breath who has a claim. Miss Stevenson sighed and beckoned him toward the back of the room, where the air was even colder and the shelves were laden with heavy leather-bound volumes. The Currys were proud, Hamish. They held that land since the time of the clearances. When old Fergus Curry died in 52, it was believed his only son had perished in the war. The land was put into a trust for the village, managed by the Kirk. But Fergus had a daughter, Margaret. She ran off with a seasonal worker, a man from the islands. The family disowned her, and her name was struck from the family Bible. She pulled down a slender, dusty volume and opened it to a page of neat, flowing script. Margaret had a son. I did some digging when Mr. Vane first started sniffing around here 3 weeks ago. He came to me, you see, offering a donation to the library if I could find proof that the lineage was dead. But the records don't lie. Margaret's son didn't stay in the islands. He came back to the mainland. He grew up here in the Highlands under another name. He didn't even know who he was until Vane's lawyers tracked him down to buy out his silence for a pittance. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle begin to vibrate with a sudden, jarring resonance. "And who is this son, Miss Stevenson? Does he have a name we'd know?" She pointed to a text line at the bottom of the page. His father's name was Angus MacTavish, but when Margaret died in childbirth, the boy was raised by his aunt. He took her husband's name. He's been living in this parish for 40 years, tending the very land that should have been his birthright. Hamish stared at the name on the page. It wasn't just a name, it was a revelation. The motive for the murder wasn't the millions of pounds involved in the resort, nor was it a simple case of a Sassenach rubbing a local the wrong way. It was a matter of ancestral pride and the crushing weight of a life spent in service to people who owned what should have been yours. Julian Vane hadn't just been an outsider, he had been the man who walked onto a person's ancestral soil and offered them a few £1,000s to sign away their soul and their history. Hamish thanked Miss Stevenson and retreated into the biting wind. He knew now why the gnome had been used. It wasn't just a heavy object found in a shed. It was a symbol of the decorative and quaint version of the Highlands that Vane wanted to sell to tourists, a plastic grinning mockery of the land Angus had worked with his bare hands for decades. Angus the gardener hadn't just killed Vane, he had executed the man who tried to transform his heritage into a theme park. The tall man in the heavy coat Elspeth had seen wasn't a professional assassin. It was a man who had reached his breaking point. Angus had waited for the storm, knowing the police would be paralyzed by the snow. He had stolen his own gnome to create a trail of breadcrumbs that would lead directly to someone like Archie, someone Blair would find logical and easy. Angus knew the village, he knew the hotel's blind spots, and he knew that as long as he looked like a dour, invisible servant, no one would ever suspect him of having the fire of a Highland chieftain in his veins. Hamish walked slowly toward the hotel, his mind weighing the tragedy of it. He had no love for Vane, a man who would have gutted Lochdubh for a profit, but murder was murder, and poor Archie was currently sitting in a cold cell in Strathbane because of Angus's cold-blooded planning. The lazy policeman was gone now, replaced by a man who felt the heavy responsibility of his badge. He couldn't just arrest Angus. Blair would never believe the useless peasant had found a motive in a library book. He needed a trap. He needed Angus to show his hand. He stopped by the hotel gates and looked at the spot where Vane's life had ended. The snow was already filling the hollows where the body had lain. He reached into his pocket and felt the blue silk ribbon. It wasn't just a clue to Elspeth's presence, it was the bait he needed. If Angus thought there was a witness who could identify him, someone who had seen him not as a gardener but as the heir to the Curry estate, he would have to act. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who was busy sniffing a frozen turnip. "Come on, Lugs, we have a little theatre. We're going to tell a few lies to catch a man who's told too many truths." He began to walk toward the potting shed at the back of the hotel grounds. The smoke was rising from the chimney of the head gardener's cottage, a thin grey line against the white sky. Hamish felt a pang of regret. He liked Angus. But the Highlands had enough ghosts without adding an innocent man like Archie MacLean to the list of the departed. The trap was set in his mind. and all it required was for Hamish to play the fool one last time. Hamish approached the head gardener's cottage with the slow, rhythmic gait of a man who had nowhere to be and all day to get there. The potting shed stood nearby, its windows frosted over with delicate patterns of ice that obscured the sharp tools hanging within. He could see Angus through the small paned window of the cottage, sitting by a peat fire, the glow casting long, flickering shadows across a face that looked as though it had been carved from the very granite of the Cairngorms. Hamish didn't knock immediately. He paused to adjust his deerstalker, letting the wind whistle through the eaves, creating a mournful harmony with the distant lowing of cattle. He needed to look defeated, a man beaten by the superior intellect of the Strathbane detectives. When he finally tapped on the door, it was a hesitant, apologetic sound. Angus opened it slowly, his large frame filling the doorway. He was wearing the heavy dark coat Elspeth had described, and his eyes were as cold and unreadable as the loch in midwinter. He didn't invite Hamish in, but the policeman eased himself past the threshold anyway, shivering with a theatrical exaggeratedness that suggested he was seeking nothing more than a moment's warmth. "It's a black day, Angus," Hamish sighed, moving toward the fire and holding out his hands. "A black day for Lochdubh. DCI Blair is over the moon, of course. He's got poor Archie in the back of a van, and he's already writing his speech for the promotion board. He thinks the cigarette case is the beginning and the end of it." Angus grunted, moving back to his wooden chair. "If the law says it's McLean, then it's McLean." The man was always a bit light-fingered with the hotel's property. It's no surprise he'd graduate to something worse when a man like Vane started flashing his gold. Hamish nodded vacantly, staring into the embers. "Aye, that's what Blair says. But there's a fly in the ointment, Angus. A nasty blue silk fly. It seems there was a witness in the garden last night, a lady who saw it all from the shadows of the gate. She didn't come forward at first because she's a journalist, Elspeth Grant, you know the one, and she was worried about her own skin. But she's seen sense now. She's at the hotel right now, writing down a description of the man she saw." He felt the atmosphere in the room change instantly. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a tightening of the air, the way the pressure drops before a thunderstorm. Angus's hand, resting on the arm of his chair, clenched into a fist so tight the knuckles turned white. "A witness?" Angus said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "In that storm?" She'd seen nothing but white and shadow. She's likely making it up for a story, trying to make herself important. "That's what I told her," Hamish said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the blue silk ribbon. He flipped it on his fingers, letting the firelight catch the shimmer of the fabric, but she was very specific. She described a tall man. A man who knew exactly where the gnome was kept. She even mentioned a specific detail about the coat he was wearing. A missing button on the left cuff, replaced with a bit of green twine. She's convinced she can identify him in a lineup. Blair is coming back at sunset to take her statement and release Archie. He's furious, naturally, but he cannot ignore a witness. Hamish watched Angus's left hand. The gardener instinctively pulled his cuff toward his body, hiding it beneath the shadow of his leg. The button was indeed missing, and Hamish had noticed the green twine earlier at the smithy. It was a small, petty detail, the kind a man overlooks when he's busy planning a murder on an ancestral scale. "She's at the hotel, you say?" Angus asked, his voice sounding strained, as if it were being squeezed through a narrow pipe. "In the conservatory," Hamish replied, standing up and stretching his limbs. "She's waiting for the light to fade so she can show Blair exactly where she was standing. I told her I'd come and fetch her when the DCI arrives. I'd better get back to the station and try to find some paperwork to look busy. If Blair finds me sitting by a fire, he'll have my badge for breakfast." Hamish walked to the door, paused, and turned back with a look of feigned realization. "Oh, and Angus, Miss Stevenson at the library asked me to tell you she's found those old Curry birth certificates you were asking about. She says they're on her desk, ready for you to collect. Funny story, isn't it? It has a way of catching up with a man no matter how deep the snow." He stepped out into the cold, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't head for the station. Instead, he whistled for lugs and circled back around the rear of the potting shed, moving through the deep drifts with the silence of a hunting cat. He knew exactly what Angus would do. A man who had killed to protect his heritage and silence a blackmailer would not sit idly by while a journalist dismantled his life. Angus was a man of the earth. He would believe in direct action, just as he had with the gnome. Hamish positioned himself behind a heavy stone railing overlooking the conservatory. The light was indeed failing, the sky turning a bruised purple as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the mountains. Inside the glass structure, a decoy was already in place. A pile of cushions and a spare coat of Priscilla's arranged in the wicker chair to look like a seated woman in the dim light. Hamish had moved Elspeth to the safety of the hotel's wine cellar an hour ago. Much to her vocal indignation, the evening silence was broken by the crunch of heavy boots on the frozen crust of the snow. Hamish peered through the stone pillars. Angus was approaching the conservatory, but he wasn't carrying a gnome this time. He was carrying a heavy iron pry bar, his face set in a mask of grim, murderous determination. He looked like a man possessed, a Highland wraith coming to claim what was his. Hamish felt the weight of his truncheon in his pocket, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. He needed Angus to speak, to incriminate himself before a witness who wasn't a useless peasant. He had left a small tape recorder, a recent and much disliked gift from Priscilla, concealed in a flower pot near the decoy. As Angus reached the glass door, he paused, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. He looked at the silhouette in the chair, his grip tightening on the iron bar. "You should have stayed in London, mistress," he hissed, his voice carrying clearly in the still cold evening. "You should have buried the dead. Vane was a thief, but you're a magpie, and I'll not have a magpie nesting on my land." He raised the bar, and Hamish knew it was time to end the charade. He stepped out from the shadows, his tall figure silhouetted against the rising moon. "It's not her land, Angus," Hamish said softly, his voice cutting through the wind. "And it's not yours either, not this way." Angus spun around, the iron bar swinging in a wide, lethal arc. The trap was sprung, but the prey was far from defeated. Hamish braced himself, his blue eyes hard and alert. The lazy cop was gone, Lochdubh's protector had arrived. The iron bar whistled through the freezing air, missing Hamish's shoulder by a fraction of an inch as he ducked with a fluidity that would have stunned DCI Blair. Angus McTavish was no longer the slow, stooped gardener who tended the Hotel S prize-winning begonias. He was a man reclaimed by a primal, ancestral fury. He recovered from the swing with surprising agility, his heavy boots kicking up a spray of ice as he squared his shoulders against the backdrop of the darkened conservatory. The moon, rising full and cold over the jagged peaks of the Monadliath Mountains, cast a silver sheen over the scene, making the gardener look like a giant of old Highland myth. "You're a clever one, Macbeth," Angus spat, his breath billowing like smoke from a dragon's nostrils. "Too clever for your own good. You sit there in that dusty station looking like a fool, but you've the eyes of a hawk. I should have known you'd be the one to come sniffing around the roots of the tree." "The roots were already rotten, Angus," Hamish replied, his voice calm and steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. He kept his hands visible, palms open, trying to lower the temperature of the confrontation. "Vane was a parasite, I'll give you that. He wanted to take the history of this glen and sell it for parts. But killing him didn't make the land yours. It only made it a graveyard. And framing Archie, that wasn't the act of a man protecting his heritage. That was just cowardice." "Cowardice?" Angus roared, the word echoing off the glass panes behind him. He lunged again, not with a swing this time, but with a thrust of the iron bar intended to pin Hamish against the stone balustrade. Hamish pivoted, his long legs moving with a deceptive speed that came from years of traversing the hills after stray sheep. He grabbed Angus's forearm, feeling the sheer, knotted strength of a man who had spent 40 years digging in the heavy Highland clay. The two men grappled in the snow, a silent struggle broken only by the sound of their labored breathing and the distant, mournful howl of lugs who were circling the perimeter, sensing the violence but waiting for his master's command. Angus was heavier, a solid wall of muscle and resentment, but Hamish had the advantage of a clear head. He knew he couldn't win a raw strength test against the outfielder. He needed to use Angus's own momentum against him. As Angus shoved him backward, trying to drive his head into the frozen masonry, Hamish deliberately went limp, lowering his centre of gravity. As they both tumbled into the snow, Hamish planted a boot in Angus's midriff and heaved upward. The gardener flew over him, landing with a bone-jarring thud against the base of the sundial, the very spot where Julian Vaughan's life had been extinguished. Angus lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of him, the iron bar slipping from his grasp to clatter against the stone. Hamish was on him in an instant, pinning the man's arms behind his back and reaching for the heavy iron handcuffs he usually kept tucked away in the station's junk drawer. "It's over, Angus," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, sombre tone. "I have the tape recorder in the flower pot. I have the witness, and I have the truth about the Curry lineage. You killed a man for a title that the law would have given you anyway if you'd just had the patience to fight for it properly." Angus stopped struggling. He slumped against the cold stone of the sundial, his face pressed into the snow. When he spoke, the fury was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing despair. "Vane said I was nothing. He sat in his fancy car and told me I was just a piece of the scenery, like a rock or a tree. He offered me £10,000 to sign a paper saying I didn't exist. £10,000 for 300 years of blood and bone. I didn't want the money, Macbeth. I wanted the respect. I wanted to stand on that hill and know that no Sassenach could ever tell me to move along." "You'd have had it," Hamish said, clicking the cuffs shut with a definitive metallic snap. "But you chose the gnome, Angus. You chose to make a joke of it. And now the only land you'll be owning is a 6x4 cell in Strathbane." Hamish stood up, brushing the snow from his greatcoat. He felt a sudden, profound weariness. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold reality of what he had to do next. He looked toward the hotel and saw the lights flickering as the guests gathered for their pre-dinner drinks, entirely unaware that a centuries-old feud had just reached its violent conclusion in the shadows of their garden. He whistled, and Lugs trotted over, looking up at Hamish with an expression of mild disapproval. I know," Hamish murmured to the dog. "It's a messy business, and it's about to get messier." He hauled Angus to his feet, the gardener now moving like a sleepwalker, his spirit broken. As they walked toward the hotel's main drive, the headlights of Blair's returning car swept across the snow, illuminating the two figures. Blair jumped out of the car before it had even stopped, his face a mask of confusion and burgeoning rage. "Macbeth, what is the meaning of this? Why have you got the gardener in irons? I told you to stay at the station. I've just spent 3 hours processing McLean, and you're out here kidnapping the staff." Hamish adopted his most vacant, wide-eyed look, the mask of the simple village policeman sliding back into place as easily as an old glove. "Oh, DCI Blair, sir. It's the most extraordinary thing. I was just coming up to the hotel to see if there was any tea left in the kitchen, and I found Mr. Mactavish here. He was in a terrible state, sir. He started confessing everything, something about a gnome and a pashmina. He even told me where he hid Mr. Vane's briefcase. It's in the old well behind the smithy. I thought I'd better bring him to you, seeing as you're the expert on these things." Blair froze, his mouth hanging open. He looked at Angus, who remained silent, staring at the ground. He looked at Hamish, who was blinking innocently. Then he looked at the police cars behind him, filled with his subordinates who were watching the scene with rapt interest. Blair knew a career-making moment when it fell into his lap, even if it had been delivered by a man he considered a moron. "Confessed, has he?" Blair said, his voice dropping into a register of oily professionalism. He adjusted his tie and puffed his chest. "Well, I suppose my interrogation of Maclean must have put the fear of God into the real culprit. Pressure, Macbeth. That's how you solve crimes. You squeeze the village until the truth pops out. I knew it wasn't Maclean all along, of course. I was just using him as a stalking horse to draw out the big fish. Of course, sir, Hamish said, handing the key to the handcuffs to a stunned Detective Anderson. You've a brilliant mind for strategy, sir. I'd never have thought of it that way. I'll just head back to my station now, if that's all right. I've got a pot of stew on the stove that's likely burning. Yes, go on then. Blair waved him away, already turning to bark orders at his team. And don't mention this to the press, Macbeth. This is now a sensitive CID. I'll handle the briefing. Hamish turned and walked away into the dark, the sounds of Blair's shouting fading behind him. He felt the weight of the blue silk ribbon still in his pocket, a tiny fragment of a world that didn't belong in Lochdubh. He had saved Archie, he had caught a killer, and most importantly, he had ensured that he wouldn't be receiving any commendations that might lead to a promotion. He wanted nothing more than the silence of his own cottage, the warmth of his dog, and the knowledge that for another season the peace of the Highlands would remain undisturbed by anything more than the wind and the snow. As he reached the edge of the hotel grounds, he saw Priscilla standing by the gate. She didn't say anything, she just watched him pass, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Hamish touched his hat and kept walking, a ghost in the Highland night, perfectly content to be the man everyone underestimated. The following morning, the sun rose over Lochdubh with a cold, blinding clarity, reflecting off the fresh mantle of snow as if the world were trying to scrub away the memory of the previous night's violence. Hamish Macbeth stood by the window of the police station, nursing a mug of coffee that was more chicory than bean, watching the spectacle unfolding in the village square. 2 television vans from the BBC and Scottish television had somehow navigated the icy passes, their satellite dishes pointing toward the heavens like silver flowers. At the centre of the throng stood Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face polished to a high sheen, his chest expanded so far that the buttons on his waistcoat looked like they might become projectiles. It was a matter of psychological endurance, Blair was telling a glamorous reporter in a fur-lined parka. I knew from the moment I set foot in this village that we were dealing with a deeply repressed ancestral motive. By applying tactical pressure to the local infrastructure and conducting a series of high-intensity interviews, most notably with a secondary suspect to flush out the primary, we were able to break the killer's resolve. McTavish realized he couldn't hide from the reach of the Strathbane CID. Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee, a ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. He could see Detective Anderson in the background, looking slightly nauseated as he clutched a file containing the confession Hamish had facilitated. The tape recorder from the flower pot had been lost in the transition, or rather, Hamish had ensured the tape was wiped after Blair had listened to it, leaving only the DCI's typed summary as the official record. If the tape had remained, it might have shown that a humble village constable had done all the heavy lifting, and that was a risk Hamish simply could not afford to take. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his musing. He didn't have to look up to know it was Chief Superintendent Daventry, a man who possessed the terrifying ability to see through Hamish's lazy facade with the precision of a master watchmaker. Daventry stepped into the small station, his presence immediately making the room feel cramped and official. He looked at Hamish, then out the window at the preening Blair, then back at Hamish again. "Quite a performance, Macbeth," Daventry said, his voice dry and devoid of the theatricality currently being displayed in the square. Blair is already being hailed as the Sherlock of the Sassenachs in the early editions. They're talking about a move to the Specialist Crime Division in Edinburgh for him. And of course there's the matter of the man who actually secured the suspect. Hamish widened his eyes, adopting a look of vacant, pleasant confusion. "It was a grand team effort, sir. I just happened to be passing the conservatory when Mr. McTavish had his change of heart. I suspect it was the weight of DCI Blair's earlier warnings that finally did the trick. A very intimidating man, the DCI. Daventry sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Don't do that, Macbeth. Not today. I've seen the reports. I know about the library research into the Curry lineage. I know about the Pashmina, and I know Angus MacTavish would not have admitted to a stone wall, let alone to Blair. You've handed a career-defining win to a man who thinks the Highlands are a suburb of Glasgow." "It's for the best, sir," Hamish said softly, dropping the act for just a moment. "Lochdubh needs a policeman who knows where the sheep go when the wind turns north. It doesn't need a decorated hero who'll be whisked away to a desk in the city within the month. If Blair takes the credit, he leaves the village. If I take the credit, I leave the village. I like my stove, sir, and Lugs is too old to learn the traffic lights in Edinburgh." Daventry walked to the window, watching Blair shake hands with the local minister, Mr. Lovat, who looked as though he had been granted a reprieve from the gallows, which, in a social sense, he had. "You're a manipulative, lazy, and infuriatingly brilliant man, Macbeth. The promotion board was prepared to offer you sergeant today. There was even talk of bringing you into the inner circle at Strathbane to modernise the rural response units." Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the drafty floorboards. "Modernise, sir? That sounds like computers and meetings. I'm terrible at meetings. I usually fall asleep after the first 10 minutes, and my typing is a disgrace to the uniform." "I told them as much," Daventry admitted, a rare twinkle of amusement in his eyes. "I told them that promoting you would be a waste of a perfectly good set of handcuffs. I said you were a fluke, a lucky wanderer who stumbled into a solution because the killer felt sorry for your lack of professional acumen. I've recommended that Blair receive the Queen's Police Medal and that you receive a formal reprimand for failing to secure the crime scene's perimeter correctly." Hamish beamed. "Thank you, sir. Truly, a reprimand is exactly what I was hoping for. It'll look grand in my file next to the one for the missing bicycle lights last year." "Get out of my sight, Macbeth," Daventry said, though there was no malice in it. "Go and find your dog. I'll be back in Strathbane before the press realise they've been sold a pup. But remember, if you solve another one this cleanly, I won't be able to save you from a desk. The next time, make it look a bit more like a mess." As Daventry departed, Hamish felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He watched the black police cars begin to depart, Blair's vehicle leading the procession like a conqueror's chariot. The circus was leaving town. The reporters would follow. The Highland escape development would be tied up in probate for a decade due to the murder, and the Curry land would remain exactly as it was, empty, wild, and silent. He went to the cupboard and pulled out a tin of premium shortbread, a gift from Priscilla that he had been saving for a moment of true victory. He gave one to Lugs, who crunched it with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, and took one for himself. Through the window he saw Priscilla walking toward the station. She was dressed in her riding gear, looking radiant in the winter light. She paused at the door, her eyes searching through the glass. Hamish knew that his life would never be simple, as long as women like Priscilla and Elspeth were around to notice what he was doing. But for now he had won the only battle that mattered. He had remained a nobody. He had stayed a part of the landscape, as invisible and essential as the peat and the heather. He sat back in his chair, the warmth of the stove finally beginning to penetrate the room, and closed his eyes. The case of the garden gnome would become a legend in Lochdubh, told over drams in the hotel bar for years to come. They would talk about the arrogant Sassenach, the tragic gardener, and the brave DCI Blair who had swooped in to save the day. And in the corner of the bar, Hamish Macbeth would sit quietly, nodding along with the story, a useless peasant who knew better than anyone that the greatest mysteries are the ones that never make it into the papers. He reached for his darning needle and the woolen sock he had abandoned the day before. There was peace again in the Highlands, and that was more than enough for a man with a warm fire and a clear conscience. The snow, which had been a chaotic fury just 24 hours earlier, now lay in a peaceful, undulating blanket across Lochdubh, turning the village into a scene from a Victorian Christmas card. The television vans had vanished as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only the deep ruts of their tires in the slush. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of silence that only returns once the experts from the south have finished explaining the Highlands to the Highlanders. Hamish sat in his small kitchen, the air thick with the comforting, savoury aroma of a mutton stew that had been simmering on the stove for hours. Luggs was stretched out across the threshold, his chin resting on his paws, watching a single fat blue bottle that had miraculously survived the frost. The police station was quiet, the black telephone remained blessedly silent, and the heavy stack of paperwork Blair had left behind was currently serving as a very effective draft excluder beneath the back door. A light tap at the door heralded the arrival of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping into the warmth and unwinding a silk scarf from her neck. She looked at the pot of stew, then at Hamish, who was busying himself with two mismatched bowls. "I see you're celebrating your failure with your usual extravagance, Hamish," she said, her voice teasing but underlined with a genuine warmth. "My mother is in a state of grace now that Blair has been officially credited with the arrest. She thinks it reflects well on the hotel's reputation to have been the stage for such high-level detective work." "It's important to keep the gentry happy, Priscilla," Hamish replied, ladling the thick broth into the bowls. "And it's even more important to keep the CID to safe distance. If Blair thinks he's the hero, he'll spend the next 6 months giving lectures in Strathbane and leave us to our sheep." Priscilla sat at the small wooden table, taking a piece of crusty bread. "And what about the Curry land? I heard the lawyers are already arguing over the lineage papers you found. Without Vane to push the development through, the Colonel says the project is as dead as a salt herring." Hamish sat opposite her, his expression unreadable. "The land has a way of looking after itself. Angus might be in a cell, but he stopped the bulldozers. There's a bit of a tragedy in that, surely. A man who loved the soil so much he had to lose his freedom to save it." "You're a romantic, Hamish Macbeth," Priscilla said, watching him over the rim of her bowl. "A lazy, manipulative romantic. You know Elspeth is writing a book about the gnome killer. She's convinced there was a secret mastermind behind it all, someone pulling the strings from the shadows." Hamish let out a short, dry laugh. "Let her write. It will give tourists something to read while they're waiting for the rain to stop. In this village, the only masterminds are the ones trying to figure out how to get a free dram at the hotel bar." They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional pop of a peat ember in the stove. For a moment the complexities of his life, the pull of the city, the demands of the force, and the tangled threads of his heart seemed to settle into a rare alignment of peace. He had done his job even if no one would ever officially know it. He had protected his own. As Priscilla rose to leave, she paused by the door, resting a hand on Hamish's arm. "You won't be able to hide forever, you know. One day a case will come along that even you can't gift wrap for Blair." "Maybe," Hamish said, walking her to the door. "But until then I think I'll just see if the salmon are moving in the lower burn. It would be a pity to let a grand night like this go to waste." After she had gone, Hamish stood on his doorstep for a long time, looking out over the loch. The water was as dark as obsidian, reflecting the first few stars of the evening. The air was chewy but clean. He whistled for Luggs, who trotted out to join him, sniffing the air for the scent of a wandering rabbit. "Well, Luggs," Hamish whispered, pulling his deerstalker tight, "the Sassenachs are gone. The minister is praying for his soul instead of his bank balance, and we've had enough stew for 3 days. I'd say the law has been upheld, wouldn't you?" Luggs let out a short, sharp bark of agreement. Hamish closed the door, the click of the latch echoing in the still night. He was home, he was staying, and in the small, shadowed world of Lochdubh, that was the greatest victory of all.